I didn't grow up in some bustling, crowded city, but looking back, I was incredibly spoiled by a nearly endless amount of outdoor activities. Hiking and camping were standard weekend plans, but the absolute best part about my hometown was the easy access to the water, specifically boating. Now, I wasn't even close to being financially capable of owning a boat, but my buddy Trevor was lucky. His family lived right on the water, and they always had a decent-sized boat. Growing up, we spent countless hours on that thing. By the time we were in high school and Trevor got his boating license, his dad would let us take it out on our own. It was during one of those high school summer days that we stumbled upon a small island located right along one of our usual boating routes. If I had to estimate its size, I'd say it was roughly the size of a large Walmart. Throughout high school, college, and early adulthood, that island became our go-to spot. Once in a blue moon, we'd see a couple of guys fishing near the shore, but most of the time it was completely abandoned. It felt like our own private island. I always assumed the reason it stayed so empty was because there wasn't a good place to dock. There was no pier, no ramp, just a tiny, narrow strip of shoreline. The rest of the island was entirely surrounded by steep, rocky cliffs and dense, overgrown trees. Trevor would have to anchor the boat a bit far out, and we'd have to swim the short distance to the shore. It sounds like a hassle, but to us it was part of the adventure. Over the years, we explored every single inch of that place. We even set up markers and signs in certain areas so we wouldn't get lost. In high school, we played epic, terrifying games of manhunt in the dead of night. As we got older, it transitioned into a party spot, a place where we could be loud, wild, and just do the stupid things people that age do. But as I grew up, I started noticing something genuinely bizarre about the island. There was absolutely no wildlife. No birds' nests in the branches, no small mammals scurrying in the brush, no reptiles sunning on the rocks. I mean, we rarely even saw bugs out there, which, if you've ever spent time in the woods of America, you know is completely unnatural. Whenever we brought someone new to the island, we'd make up stories to freak them out, telling them the place was cursed or haunted just to get a reaction. Since we made everything up, I never actually believed there was anything to fear, until one night a few years ago that I still can't logically explain. Act 2. The Campout. By this point in our lives, Trevor had bought his own boat. One afternoon, he pitched an idea that honestly surprised me we hadn't thought of before. He suggested we stay overnight on the island. He could fit 8 of us on his boat, and we could have a massive campout. It sounded like the perfect weekend plan. Plus, a girl in our friend group named Megan and I had a mutual crush on each other at the time, so I figured this would be the perfect opportunity to get some alone time away from the crowd. We took off from the marina in the afternoon and pulled up to the island around 4 p.m. The first few hours were amazing. We gave Megan and the newcomers a full tour of the island, showing off all the secret spots we'd discovered over the years. As night began to fall, we gathered firewood, cooked up some hot dogs over the open flame, and cracked open a few drinks. Up to that point, it was honestly one of the best nights I'd ever had out there. Trevor kept the fire blazing, and we all sat in a circle, laughing, telling stories, and just enjoying the vibe. It was several hours into the night when I started to notice a shift in Megan's behavior. Usually she was the life of the party, always laughing, smiling, and talking, but for some reason she had gone completely silent. She looked lost in thought, staring blankly over my shoulder. When I nudged her and asked if she was doing okay, she didn't look at me. Instead, her eyes stayed locked on the tree line, which was only about 20 feet from where we were sitting. Beyond the reach of our campfire, those woods were pitch black. Before answering, she paused, her eyes scanning the darkness. "I keep hearing noises in the trees," she whispered. It sounds like something is moving out there." I tried to ease her mind, telling her it was probably just an animal, but she immediately countered with what we had told her earlier, that we had never seen a single animal on this island. I laughed it off and reminded her that we had also never been on the island overnight before. I told her it was probably just some nocturnal creature and that we had nothing to worry about. She didn't look convinced. She kept squinting into the dark, her posture stiffening. "I don't think that's an animal out there," she murmured. I thought maybe she was just tipsy, but I looked down and realized she had barely finished half of her first beer. Before long, Megan's unease started bleeding into the rest of the group. Everyone except Trevor and me were getting visibly freaked out. Trevor's girlfriend, Rosie, nervously asked if we were absolutely certain we were the only ones on the island. We assured her we were. There were no other boats anchored anywhere near the shore, and we had walked the entire perimeter earlier that afternoon without seeing a single trace of human life. I was confident that the dancing shadows from the campfire were just playing tricks on their eyes and ears. But once fear takes root in a group, it's almost impossible to calm people down. Sensing the mood was ruined, Trevor pulled a heavy-duty flashlight out of his backpack. "Everyone just relax," he said, trying to sound authoritative. "Watch, I'm going to shine it at the woods and show you that there is nobody out there and that your imaginations are running wild." He clicked the light on. A powerful, blinding beam pierced the darkness. Slowly, Trevor began to pan the flashlight horizontally across the tree line. Suddenly, Megan let out a bird-curdling scream and pointed. Everyone jumped, our hearts hammering against our ribs purely from her reaction. "There! Go back! There are 2 people standing in the woods!" she shrieked. Nobody else had caught it on the first pass. Quickly, Trevor snapped the flashlight beam back to the left, focusing on the exact spot Megan was pointing to. And sure enough, our blood ran cold. Standing just inside the edge of the tree line were 2 people. They were standing completely still, side by side, staring directly back at us. The image of them burned into my mind, and it is still one of the most terrifying things I have ever witnessed with my own eyes. They were dressed in dark, ragged clothing and were almost completely camouflaged by the brush, which is why we hadn't noticed them before. In a moment of pure shock, Trevor flinched backward and the beam of light accidentally whipped away from them. When he scrambled back up and shone the light back in that exact direction, they were gone, completely vanished. Absolute panic erupted. We had all clearly seen them that time. 2 actual people were watching us from the dark, and now they were moving. Trevor started yelling into the woods, his voice cracking with a mix of adrenaline and anger, telling them to show themselves. In a display of sheer testosterone-fueled stupidity, a few of the guys ran toward the tree line to try and intimidate whoever it was. When we got to the edge of the woods, there was no one there. But as we stood in the quiet darkness, we could hear it, a faint, mocking laughter echoing deep from within the forest. I turned to Trevor, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. "Dude, we need to leave, right now. We don't know what these people want." I could tell Trevor's pride was hurting, but looking around at our terrified friends, he ultimately nodded. We scrambled back to the campsite, throwing our essential gear into bags and frantically kicking dirt over the fire to put it out. The entire time, Megan was crying, begging us to hurry up. She kept saying she could hear the whispering and laughter getting closer and closer, but no matter where we swung our flashlights, we couldn't spot them. We waded out into the cold water, practically pushing each other to get onto the boat.
Just as Trevor and I were about to climb up over the stern, Megan let out another horrific scream from the deck, pointing the light back down onto the narrow beach. The two people were no longer hiding in the woods. They were standing right there on the shore, bathed in the flashlight beam. I scrambled onto the boat, but just as Trevor was about to pull himself up, the woman on the shore did something that froze us completely. She called out Trevor's name. Her voice was clear, loud, and completely devoid of emotion. Trevor stopped dead in his tracks. He turned his head and looked at her, completely entranced. The woman stared directly into his eyes and spoke again. She told him that she wanted him to come back to the island and walk with her into the forest. She said she wanted him to show her something cool and promised that afterward she would come back for the rest of us. To this day, it creeps me out to admit it, but Trevor actually looked like he was going to do it. It was like his brain had completely short-circuited. He stepped back down toward the water, his eyes totally blank. Seeing him move, a surge of adrenaline hit me. I reached over the side of the boat, grabbed him by his collar, and forcibly yanked him backward onto the deck. He didn't say a word. He didn't even acknowledge that he had been about to step back onto that island. We fired up the engine, pulled the anchor, and slammed the throttle forward. As we sped away into the night, Megan kept the flashlight trained on the shore. The man was gone, but the woman just stood there at the water's edge, motionless, watching us recede into the distance until she finally turned and walked back into the pitch-black woods. Trevor, still in a daze, took a wide lap around the island to see if there was a boat hidden on the other side. Disturbingly, there was nothing. Those two people were already on that island when we arrived, and we had absolutely no idea how they got there, where they came from, or how long they had been waiting for us. The island was far enough from the mainland that it would be an incredibly grueling, life-threatening swim, especially in the dark. Whenever I think back to that night, my mind goes to some incredibly dark places. There wasn't any known place on that island to hide. We should have heard them or seen them when we were exploring in the afternoon. It genuinely felt like those two people had just materialized out of thin air. Trevor and I went back to the island exactly one more time after that night. It was the very next afternoon. We were terrified, but we needed closure. We wanted to see if we could find any physical evidence of who those people were. We anchored the boat, swam ashore, and cautiously stepped into the woods near our old campsite. Just a few feet into the tree line, we stopped dead in our tracks. Leaning up against a thick oak tree was a disturbing life-size human figure. It had been intricately crafted entirely out of tightly bound sticks and dead branches. We didn't stay a second longer. We turned right around, ran back to the boat, and tore out of there. I have no idea what truly happened that night or what those people wanted from us, but I can confidently say that there is something deeply wrong with that island. I have absolutely no interest in ever going back, but I guess I'm just thankful we all made it off that shoreline alive.
The next story. There's a specific story that has been eating away at me for a few years now. Whenever I find myself completely alone, my mind inevitably drifts back to this exact day, and honestly, it takes me to some pretty dark places. I've shared this experience with a couple of people in my life, secretly hoping they'd laugh it off, call me crazy, and tell me I was just overthinking things. But unfortunately, every single person who hears it reacts the same way. They think something truly awful happened. It's one of those stories that if you dwell on it too much before bed, you're not going to get any sleep. This all went down a few years ago at the local marina where I used to keep my boat docked. Now, if you've never spent time around boat docks or marinas in America, they aren't exactly the kind of places you associate with true crime or horror, unless you have a phobia of deep water or drowning. Marinas are usually incredibly peaceful, low-stress environments. Just old guys drinking coffee, people washing down their hulls, and the smell of salt water. For the most part, I've always been a solitary guy. As soon as I was old enough to get a job and save up some real money, I bought myself a modest cabin cruiser. I've owned a boat since I was 19 years old. During the specific summer of this story, I practically lived on it. The marina I chose was way quieter than the main commercial harbors down the coast, and I would spend countless days just relaxing on deck, reading, doing a little fishing, and just enjoying the slow pace of life. One feature this specific marina offered was something called a transient slip. If you're not familiar with boating terms, a transient slip is basically a temporary parking spot. If someone is traveling up the coast or gets caught in bad weather and can't make it back to their home port, the marina rents them a slip for a night or two. Over the years, I met tons of fascinating people from all over the country who utilized those slips. But one Tuesday afternoon, a completely ordinary-looking boat pulled into the marina and was assigned the transient slip right next to mine.
The spot right next to my boat had been vacant for about a week, so this guy docked right alongside me. As he was bringing his boat in, I did what any decent boater does. I stepped out onto my deck and reached out to grab his lines to help him tie off to the cleat. Before I could even grab the rope, the guy snapped. He glared up at me and barked, "I don't want or need your help. Back off." I stepped back, hands up, a little startled but not necessarily offended. I get it. Some boat owners are incredibly particular about their vessels and don't want strangers touching their gear, so I let him be. Once he finally secured his lines and finished tying up, I tried to smooth things over. I stepped back to the edge of my boat, introduced myself, and said, "Hey man, no worries, just letting you know if you need anything tonight, just knock on my cabin door." The guy slowly turned his head and looked at me. His face was completely blank, no nod, no thank you, nothing. He just walked right past me, stepped down into his front V-berth cabin, and slammed the heavy door shut behind him. Now, I'm a pretty quiet guy myself, and I don't care much for forced small talk, but when someone offers a basic neighborly greeting, you usually at least grunt in acknowledgement. This guy's total lack of basic human decency put a really bad taste in my mouth. But right before I turned around to go back inside my own cabin, a stench hit me. It was a horrific, overpowering smell. I started sniffing around on my deck, thinking maybe a dead fish had gotten stuck in my bilge or something, but I quickly realized the odor was venting directly out of the open hatch of his cabin. It wasn't the smell of old bait, and it wasn't bad body hygiene. It was infinitely worse. It was thick, sweet, and putrid, the unmistakable smell of biological decay. The guy never gave me his name, but as I was looking over his center console, I noticed a stainless steel coffee thermos sitting in the cup holder next to the steering wheel. Etched into the side of it in block letters was the name Buddy.
About an hour passed, and the sun was starting to set. That's when I started hearing a strange commotion coming from Buddy's boat. It sounded like heavy objects being violently smashed against the floorboards, followed by the sharp crack of breaking glass. There was a small porthole window on the side of his cabin, but he had it completely blacked out from the inside with a thick towel. A moment later, Buddy emerged from the cabin. He didn't look at me this time. He just stomped down the wooden dock toward the main marina building where the public showers and restrooms were located.
Watching him walk away was the first real look I got at the guy. He was easily 6 feet tall, a very husky, broad-shouldered fellow, probably in his late 60s. He was mostly bald, except for a thin horseshoe of stark white hair framing his head. But his most jarring feature were his glasses. He wore these thick, black-rimmed spectacles with lenses so heavily magnified that they took up half his face, making his eyes look distorted and unnaturally large. Buddy was gone for maybe 10 minutes, but during those 10 minutes, the sounds inside his boat didn't stop. Every single minute, I would hear something heavy thumping against the hull, accompanied by a strange, muffled, rhythmic scratching sound. It was completely contained within the locked cabin. I figured, okay, the guy obviously has a dog in there that he didn't report to the harbor master. When Buddy finally walked back down the dock, I decided to try talking to him one more time. I wanted to be helpful, but I also wanted to let him know I could hear what was happening. "Hey," I called out as he stepped onto his deck. "Just a heads up, I heard some banging around in your cabin while you were gone. If you've got a dog in there, there's a massive fenced-in grass field right past the parking lot if you need to let him out to run around." Buddy stopped dead in his tracks. He turned around, walked directly over to the stern of my boat where I was sitting, leaned over the railing until his magnified eyes were inches from my face, and whispered in a low, menacing growl, "It ain't a dog, it's only me." Then he turned on his heel, stormed back into his cabin, and through the lock. I sat there in the fading twilight, a cold knot forming in my stomach. If he didn't have a pet, and if he was completely alone, what the hell was making all that noise while he was gone? For the rest of the evening, Buddy's boat went completely dead silent. The foul smell would occasionally drift over whenever the evening breeze shifted, but there was no more thumping. I finally turned off my lights and went to bed around 10 p.m.
At exactly 3 a.m., I woke up. I didn't wake up naturally. I was startled awake by a violent thud against the side of my hull. I lay perfectly still in the pitch blackness of my cabin, listening. The sound was coming from Buddy's boat again, but this time it didn't sound like a restless pet. It sounded like a frantic, desperate struggle. I could hear muffled shifting, bare feet scraping against fiberglass, and then I heard Buddy's voice. He wasn't yelling, he was using a harsh, aggressive, venomous whisper. "Shut up," he hissed. "Shut the hell up." He was clearly trying to keep his voice down, trying not to wake up the marina. I didn't hear a second voice talk back to him, but what I did hear sent a shiver straight down my spine. Through the thin walls of our adjacent boats, I heard a strained, high-pitched, muffled whimpering sound. It sounded like someone trying to scream through heavy layers of duct tape. I heard Buddy growl the word "enough," followed by a dull, heavy impact. Then total suffocating silence returned to the slip. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, sitting on the edge of my mattress in the dark, staring at my phone, my heart pounding in my throat. I tried to rationalize it. I tried to tell myself it was a weird radio show, a medical issue, or that I was just letting my imagination get the best of me. At 7 a.m., the sun finally came up. I peeked through my blinds and saw Buddy step out of his cabin carrying a heavy canvas duffel bag. He locked the door behind him and headed down the long dock toward the restrooms again. Act 5. The Mistake. I knew it was an incredibly stupid idea. Every survival instinct in my body was screaming at me to stay put, but something entirely beyond my control compelled me to step onto his boat. If someone was in there, if someone was hurt, I couldn't just sit by and do nothing. I waited until Buddy turned the corner of the marina building and was completely out of sight. I slipped off my boat and stepped onto his deck.
The moment my feet hit his grip tape, that putrid, rotting smell almost knocked me off my feet. It was a wave of pure, unadulterated decay. I crept down the short steps to his V-berth cabin door. I noticed right away that he had installed a heavy-duty aftermarket deadbolt knock onto the wooden frame. I leaned my ear against the wood, took a deep breath, and knocked twice. "Is anyone in there?" I whispered frantically. "Do you need help?" Instead of silence, the muffled whimpering sound immediately started up again, but this time, because I was standing right at the threshold, it was much louder. It was frantic, rapid, and sounded like absolute, terrified pleading. Panic completely seized my brain. I didn't know what to do. I didn't have a tool to break the lock, and I had no idea how much time I had left before Buddy came back. Fear overrode my morality. I spun around, ran back to my boat, scrambled down into my cabin, and shut the door. I grabbed my cell phone, my thumbs hovering over the keypad to dial 911, but I froze. It's incredibly easy for someone listening to this story right now to say, "I would have called the cops instantly," but hindsight is always 20/20. When you are caught in the middle of a bizarre, terrifying situation in real time, a million conflicting thoughts race through your head. You start convincing yourself that you're overreacting, that you're going to get an old man arrested over a misunderstanding, or that you'll get sued for trespassing. As I sat there, staring blankly at my phone screen, trying to build up the courage to hit call, a shadow fell over my cabin. I slowly looked up at my small rectangular window. Standing right there on the dock, staring directly through the glass at me, was Buddy. My heart completely stopped. He was just standing there, those massive, magnified eyes locked onto mine through the glass. He didn't yell, he didn't threaten me, he just stared at me with a cold, knowing look for what felt like an eternity. Then he slowly turned around and walked back to his boat. I watched through the blinds as he quickly untied his lines, pushed off from the dock, fired up his engine, and navigated out of the channel until his vessel was nothing but a speck on the horizon. I never saw him or his boat ever again. Conclusion. This happened years ago, and to this day I am plagued by this experience. I still try to tell myself that I was just a dumb kid with an overactive imagination, that maybe he just had an illegal, exotic animal hidden in there. But deep down, in the pit of my stomach, I know that's a lie. I grew up in a rougher neighborhood where you constantly heard your neighbors screaming and throwing things through the walls. It always sounded like someone was going to end up dead, but the culture was always to mind your own business, look away, and don't call the law. Nobody ever died, so you learned to just tune it out. Unfortunately, I carried that exact same mind-your-own-business mentality onto the water that morning. It is the single greatest regret of my life. I just pray to God that my theories are wrong and that Buddy wasn't the absolute monster I think he was.
The next story. I've never been a superstitious guy. I'm sharing this story today because it happened just over 3 months ago, and honestly, I'm genuinely desperate to hear what other people think about it. I always figured that as a modern society, we had completely moved past old wives' tales, curses, and maritime folklore. But after what I experienced out on the water, my skepticism has been completely shaken. It started on a crisp morning a little over 3 months ago. My 2 buddies, Dustin and Chris, and I managed to get the same day off from work. Whenever we were fortunate enough to align our schedules, we always took advantage of it by heading out on Dustin's small fishing boat. Our routine was always the same. We'd hit the boat launch right around dawn and spend the entire morning out on the water, completely cut off from the rest of the world. This specific morning started out just like any other trip, but about 30 minutes after we cleared the harbor and reached the deep water, I noticed Dustin start to mumble anxiously under his breath. He was gripping the steering wheel tightly, staring intently at the horizon. Chris and I asked what was wrong. Without saying a word, Dustin just raised his hand and pointed straight ahead. Way out on the horizon was a beautiful, massive boat. Now, I'm not a boat guy myself. Even though I love to fish, I don't know the first thing about hull designs or marine mechanics. To Chris and me, it just looked like a luxury vessel drifting in the distance. But as we kept getting closer, Dustin pointed out a detail that immediately changed the mood on our boat. Flying high from the boat's mast was a bright orange flag. On the center of that flag were two distinct shapes, a square and a circle. I had no idea what it meant at the time, but Dustin quickly informed us that this was a VDS flag, which stands for Visual Distress Signal. In the boating world, flying that flag means you are in immediate danger and require urgent assistance. Normally, on a body of water that massive, you mind your own business and keep your distance from other watercraft. But if someone out there was genuinely in distress, we couldn't just turn around and leave. Dustin cut the engine down to a crawl as we drew near. He cupped his hands around his mouth and yelled across the water, asking if everyone on board was okay. The boat was massive. Dustin called it a yacht. A smaller one, sure, but it absolutely dwarfed Dustin's little aluminium fishing rig. It just rocked back and forth on the gentle waves, completely lifeless. Chris nervously asked if we should just turn around and leave, but Dustin hesitated. I pulled out my phone to try and call the Coast Guard, but we were so far out that I had absolutely zero cell service. I looked at the guys and said, "Look, I'm CPR certified. Let me just jump over onto their deck and make sure nobody's inside having a medical emergency." Dustin didn't love the idea. He was worried that if there was an old guy inside who was just resting, me suddenly bursting into his cabin might give him a heart attack. We argued back and forth for a minute, but knowing that someone could be bleeding out or unconscious inside, Dustin finally agreed to pull our boat flush against the side of the yacht. I stepped onto the gunwale and leapt over onto the stern.
The moment my boots hit the deck, I started shouting at the top of my lungs, "Hello? Is anyone on board? I'm answering your distress flag." I wanted to make sure I was loud enough to announce my presence so I wouldn't startle anyone. As I walked across the open deck, I noticed signs of very recent human activity. 4 high-end fishing rods were lined up along the railing, fully rigged and looking like they were just about to be dropped into the water. On the deck table sat 3 ceramic coffee mugs. I walked up to them and my heart skipped a beat. Steam was still actively rising out of the coffee. On one of the cushioned bench seats, a nice Michigan State pullover jacket was thrown down, looking like someone had just tossed it aside a few minutes ago. I made my way toward a heavy glass sliding door that led into the main cabin. It was slid wide open. As I stepped over the threshold, I looked down at the floorboards. There were fresh, wet, muddy footprints of various sizes scattered all over the entryway. On its own, finding mud on a fishing boat isn't that weird, but the fact that there were multiple different footprints and steaming hot coffee, yet the entire boat felt completely abandoned, made the hair on my arms stand up. I stepped into the main room, and it was an absolute disaster. Every single cabinet door was slung wide open, and personal belongings were scattered all over the floor, as if someone had frantically ransacked the place. Straight ahead was a small sleeping quarters, a bed tucked neatly into a cozy wooden nook. The mattress was empty except for a massive pile of pillows and heavy blankets that were all balled up tightly against the back wall. The very last place left to check was the bathroom. The door was shut tight. My heart was absolutely hammering against my ribs, not because I believed in ghosts, but because I half expected to open that door and find a gruesome crime scene. I wrapped my hand around the knob, slowly twisted it, and pushed it open. Just like the rest of the boat, the bathroom was completely empty. I let out a sigh of relief, turned around, and began walking back toward the open sliding door to get back to my friends. But out of the very corner of my eye, I caught a sudden, subtle movement. I whipped my head around toward the sleeping nook. Right before my eyes, the pillows suddenly rolled off the mattress and the heavy derrick blanket began to violently shift and lift upward. From beneath the tightly balled-up covers, a frail, elderly woman sat up and stared directly at me. I gasped, taking a sharp step back. Trying to keep my voice as calming as possible, I said, "Ma'am, it's okay. Don't be scared. I'm only here to help you because we saw your distress flag outside. Are you okay?" The woman didn't say a single word. In fact, she didn't react at all. She just sat there on the mattress, completely emotionless, staring right through me. She was small, her gray hair was meticulously braided, and her skin was incredibly tan and weathered. It almost looked like wrinkled rubber. Her dark eyes were completely wide and vacant. She barely even looked like she was breathing. Honestly, if I hadn't just seen her physically move under the covers and blink a few times, I would have sworn I was looking at a corpse. The sheer creepiness of her blank stare sent an icy chill down my spine. I felt like she was looking right through my soul. Realizing I wasn't going to get any answers out of her, I slowly backed away toward the exit. I'm going to step back outside to my friend's boat, okay? We're going to get you some help."
I turned around, sprinted out of the cabin, and leaped back over onto Dustin's boat. "We need to ride back toward the coast until we get a cell signal right now," I panted, my voice shaking. I quickly explained to Dustin and Chris about the elderly woman hiding under the blankets and how she seemed to be in a severe state of shock. But while Dustin and Chris were trying to process what I was saying, the sliding door on the yacht opened wider. The elderly woman stepped out onto the deck. She walked with a strange, slow, deliberate pace straight toward the back of the boat where the orange VDS flag was flying. She reached up with her tattered hands, slowly lowered the flag from the mast, and threw it carelessly under the deck table. Then, without ever casting a single glance in our direction, she turned around and walked back inside, closing the sliding door behind her. We were completely stunned. She had intentionally taken down the distress flag, but I argued with the guys that she clearly wasn't well and needed professional medical assistance. Dustin agreed. He slammed the throttle forward and we sped back in the direction of the mainland until the signal bars on my phone finally lit up. I immediately dialed the authorities and reported the exact coordinates of the yacht, explaining that there was an elderly woman on board who appeared to be alone, despite the overwhelming evidence of other passengers. The dispatcher assured me that a Coast Guard boat would be dispatched to investigate. Not knowing how long that would take and feeling a deep sense of moral obligation, we decided to turn our boat around and head back to the yacht's location just in case she needed us before the authorities arrived. But when we arrived back at the exact coordinates, the massive yacht was completely gone. There was absolutely no trace of it. We scanned the open water in every single direction, but a vessel that size couldn't have just disappeared over the horizon that quickly. We had no idea which way she could have gone, so we couldn't follow her. The mood was completely ruined, so we packed up our gear and headed back to Dustin's house. We never heard back from the police or the Coast Guard. I have no idea if they ever found that boat or if they just ignored our call because the water was empty when they arrived. Ever since that morning, when I add up all the pieces of that day, the math just doesn't make sense. That woman actively summoned us with a distress flag, but the moment I boarded, she hid, refused to speak, and then took the flag down to make us leave. Where did the other passengers go?
Who poured those 3 steaming cups of hot coffee right before I jumped onto the deck? But the real reason why my friends think I was cursed that morning is because ever since I stepped foot on that yacht, I have had a streak of absolutely horrific, ruinous luck. Within the span of a single month, I unexpectedly lost my job, and just a few weeks later, I was involved in a massive car accident that completely totaled my vehicle. Dustin's elderly father, who spent his entire life working on commercial crabbing boats, told us an old maritime folktale about an entity on the water that mimics a vessel in distress to lure unsuspecting sailors into an ancient curse. Personally, I try to force myself to believe that my sudden bad luck is just a terrible coincidence, and using a curse as a scapegoat is just a convenient excuse. But deep down, when the nights get quiet, I can't stop thinking about those steaming cups of coffee, that leathery, vacant stare, and the yacht that vanished into thin air.